She was 30 years old when she carried the first crate of 200 Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl keats from the front seat of her late husband's faded green 1966 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck into the small mobile wooden roost house she had hand-built that summer under the spreading branches of the single live oak tree at the back of the 80-acre Newton County, Texas, Hereford pasture. The keats had been hatched and held 2 weeks past their natural release age in the kerosene-heated brooder shed on the north side of the small clapboard farmhouse, and on the cool, dry second Sunday of October 1972, she set the crate down on the wagon wheel platform at the base of the live oak tree and tilted it gently forward and tipped the small spotted blue and red-headed birds out by the handful into the dappled shade of the pasture grass. They scattered in tight, chattering small flocks of 15 and 20 birds, and within 40 minutes they had begun the slow, methodical pasture and cattleback foraging pattern that her grandmother Eulalie Boudreaux had described to her in the long, quiet evenings of her childhood on the small Acadian-French homestead near Mamou in Evangeline Parish, Louisiana. Her 35 red-bodied, white-faced Hereford cattle lifted their heads from the Bermuda grass pasture and watched the small spotted birds chatter across the open ground, and after about an hour, the boldest of the heifers lowered her broad red shoulder, and a young guinea hen hopped up onto the heifer's back and began to pick a small black engorged Lone Star tick from the heifer's withers, and the heifer twitched once, and then stood patiently and did not move, and Verna Boudreaux, who had buried her husband Beauregard Boudreaux 14 months earlier under a small white limestone cross in the St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery at the edge of Burkeville, set her hand on the wagon wheel platform and watched the small spotted bird work the broad red back of the patient heifer, and she did not smile, but the set of her quiet, stubborn mouth eased for the first time since the May night the East Texas Highway Patrol had come to her door with their hats against their chests. There, across the section fence to the west, and visible from the live oak tree at the back of her pasture, the commercial Tatum Cattle Company conventional Hereford operation was running its early autumn dip cycle. The galvanized iron insecticide dip-vat at the north end of the Tatum holding pen was full to the brim with the milky white organophosphate solution that the regional agricultural chemical supply cooperatives in Beaumont and Lufkin and Nacogdoches had been selling to the East Texas commercial Hereford herds since 1973, and the dip crew in their tall rubber boots and yellow oilskin aprons were running the Tatum yearlings one by one through the vat in a slow, steady shoot-and-pour rhythm that had been the standard tick and fly control protocol of the Southern American commercial cattle industry for nearly 2 decades. Cyrus Tatum, the 63-year-old commercial Hereford cattleman who had inherited his father's 840-acre conventional operation in 1949, and who had served 3 terms as president of the Newton County Cattlemen's Association, was standing in his sweat-stained tan Stetson straw rancher's hat at the cross-fence corner of the section road with his thumbs in his belt and his weather-tanned ruddy face turned toward Verna Boudreaux's pasture, and the small spotted birds chattering across the open ground and perched on the broad backs of her quiet, patient Hereford cattle, and his paternalistic, worried mouth was set in the same patient, pitying expression he had worn at the funeral mass for Beauregard Boudreaux at St. Joseph in May 1971. He shook his head once, slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a beloved younger sister who has decided to do something he believes will end badly. And he turned and walked back along the fence line toward his own pens and the dip-vat and the yellow oil-skinned crew. He did not speak to her, and she did not call out to him, and the small spotted birds chattered on. The mockery, which Verna Boudreaux had been told to expect by her grandmother Eulalie, and by the 4 older Cajun-French women in the Burkeville parish, who had pressed the leather-bound family receipt book into her hands at the St. Joseph funeral reception in May 1971, began in earnest the following Wednesday morning at the small Burkeville feed and seed store on State Highway 87. Loretta Tatum, the 58-year-old commercial cattleman's wife with the tightly permed silver blonde hair and the cat-eye gold-framed glasses and the heavily powdered face, was standing at the counter of the small clapboard feed and seed, paying for a pallet of organophosphate-impregnated cattle-fly ear tags, when Verna Boudreaux walked in with her small leather tally book in the deep pocket of her waxed canvas brown stockman's apron, and a list of Guinea Fowl scratch grain and crushed oyster shell needs in her hand. Loretta Tatum turned at the counter and lifted her chin and threw her head back, and her painted coral pink mouth opened in a laugh that carried clear across the small store to the 4 men in faded chambray shirts at the wooden bench by the wood stove, who turned their heads to watch, and she clapped her powdered hand over her mouth in mock pity, and her judgmental hazel eyes behind the cat-eye glasses widened in mock astonishment, and she said, loud enough to carry across the section road, that she had heard from Cyrus that the poor Boudreaux widow had turned 200 African chicken birds loose with her cattle to do the work of a proper dip-vat, and that she did hope the poor girl had not lost her mind entirely along with her husband. The 4 men at the wood stove threw their heads back, and the storekeeper, Mr. Beauchamp at the counter, rolled his eyes, and even the small Cajun-French sister, Marie-Cécile, from the parish school, who was buying a pound of penny nails for the 3rd-grade carpentry lesson, covered her mouth with her hand and looked away, and Verna Boudreaux, who had not been raised to argue with foolish women in feed and seed stores, set her list on the counter and waited quietly for Mr. Beauchamp to fill it. She paid in cash from a small class purse, and she walked out of the store and got back into the faded green Chevrolet pickup truck, and she drove the 7 miles home along State Highway 87, and she did not cry. And when she reached the gate at the section road, she stopped the truck and got out and walked the fence line to the live oak tree at the back of the pasture, and she stood for a long time watching the small spotted birds chatter across her pasture and perch on the broad backs of her quiet, patient Hereford cattle, and she set her hand on the rough bark of the live oak tree, and she said aloud to the warm October air in the soft Acadian-French her grandmother Eulalie had taught her in the long, quiet evenings of her childhood, that the birds knew what they were doing, and that her grandmother had been right, and that the laughter of foolish women in feed and seed stores would not change the work of small spotted birds on the broad backs of Hereford cattle in the warm October air of the East Texas piney woods. Her grandmother, Eulalie Boudreaux, had been 71 years old in the summer of 1948, when she had first told Verna, then 6 years old and sitting cross-legged on the polished pine floor, of the small white-painted Mamou farmhouse, with the slow ticking of the brass parlor clock and the faint smell of file gumbo from the iron pot on the wood stove in the kitchen, The long story of the small spotted birds and the cattle and the bayou-country tick fevers. Eulalie Boudreaux had been born in 1877 on the small Acadian-French homestead near Mamou in Evangeline Parish, Louisiana, to a mother whose own mother had been carried as an infant on the long, terrible 19th century overland journey from the Acadian-French resettlement villages of Saint-Jacques-de-Lachegan in Lower Quebec, down through the river bottoms of the lower Mississippi to the Cajun-French settlements of the Atchafalaya Basin, and the small spotted Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl had come with the Boudreaux family on the long overland journey in a small wicker basket carried under the bench seat of a Conestoga wagon, the way the family Bible had come, and the small brass mortar and pestle, and the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of bayou-country herbal remedies. The small spotted birds, Eulalie had explained to the 6-year-old Verna in the soft Acadian French of the long, quiet 1948 evenings, had been the bayou-country secret of the small Cajun-French cattle keepers for 140 years before the first commercial agricultural chemical supply cooperative had ever sold a single drum of organophosphate dip solution into the lower Louisiana parishes. And the small spotted birds had walked the broad backs of the Cajun-French cattle and picked the Lone Star ticks and the Gulf Coast ticks and the seasonal biting flies from the cattle hides for so many generations that the cattle themselves had learned to lower their broad shoulders and stand quietly when the small spotted birds approached, and the small spotted birds in turn had learned to chatter a soft warning chatter when the bobcat or the cottonmouth or the coyote approached the pasture from the bayou country brush, and the cattle had learned to listen for the chatter and to raise their broad red heads, and the partnership of the small spotted birds and the broad red cattle had kept the Cajun-French cattle of the Atchafalaya Basin in good health through the long, terrible bayou country tick fever decades of the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s, when the commercial Anglo-American cattle herds across the western Louisiana and the eastern Texas border country had been falling by the hundreds and the thousands to the same redwater and pale-eyed wasting that the Cajun-French parish-veterinarians had only later begun to call by the formal Latin names of Babesia and Anaplasma. Eulalie Boudreaux had pressed into the small palm of the 6-year-old Verna in that summer of 1948 a single small dark gray lavender guinea fowl feather, densely spotted with hundreds of small round white pearl dots, and she had told her granddaughter that the small spotted feather and the small spotted bird and the broad red back of the patient Cajun-French cow were the long Acadian-French inheritance of the Boudreaux family women, and that one day, when Verna had her own pasture and her own cattle and her own work, she would remember the small spotted feather, and she would know what to do. Beauregard Boudreaux, the man Verna had married in the small white St. Joseph Catholic chapel at the edge of Burkeville in the summer of 1963, when she was 21 years old and he was 24, had been the third generation of his family to work as a long-haul cut pine logging truck driver for Kirby Forest Industries out of the company's Silsbee, Texas mill yard, and on a rainy midweek night in May 1971, his loaded 40,000-pound long-bed log truck had hydroplaned on the wet asphalt of State Highway 87 north of Burkeville and had jackknifed against the concrete abutment of the small Trinity River tributary bridge, and had rolled onto its driver's side and had crushed the cab, and Beauregard Boudreaux had been pronounced dead at the scene by the East Texas Highway Patrol corporal, who had driven the 7 miles to the small clapboard farmhouse at 4:20 in the morning to set his hat against his chest and to tell her. She had been 29 years old and 7 months married to her work, and she had buried him under the small white limestone cross in the St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery at the edge of Burkeville on a warm, bright Tuesday in late May 1971, with the small white-painted clapboard chapel filled to the back pews with Cajun-French and Anglo-Texan and the 4 older Cajun-French parish women who had pressed the leather-bound family receipt book of her grandmother Eulalie into her hands at the funeral reception with the quiet words that now, child, the work was hers. The 80-acre Hereford pasture and the small clapboard farmhouse and the kerosene-heated brooder shed and the mobile wooden roost house under the live oak tree at the back of the pasture had been deeded into Verna Boudreaux's name alone by the Newton County probate clerk in late August 1971, and through the long, quiet autumn and winter of 1971 and the long, quiet spring and summer of 1972, she had read and reread the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of Eulalie Boudreaux's 19th-century bayou-country cattle and poultry husbandry, and she had ordered 200 Pearl Gray and Lavender heritage Guinea Fowl keats from a small heritage poultry breeder near Opelousas, Louisiana, whose grandmother had received her foundation stock from Eulalie Boudreaux's own grandmother in 1892. And on the cool, dry second Sunday of October 1972, she had carried the small spotted blue and red-headed birds out into the 80-acre Newton County pasture, and she had turned them loose on the broad red backs of the patient Hereford cattle. The first year, 1973, was quiet. The small spotted birds worked the pasture and the cattlebacks in the slow, methodical, chattering rhythm that Eulalie had described, and Verna Boudreaux kept a careful daily tally book in the deep pocket of her waxed canvas brown stockman's apron, and she recorded the small details of the work. The morning tick counts she made by hand-combing the shoulder fur of the 3 lead heifers at the wooden squeeze-chute by the live oak tree, the weekly weight gain measurements she took by hand tape on the yearlings, the spring and autumn body condition scores she assigned by visual inspection on the cows and calves, and the careful absent column after absent column of clinical symptom entries that the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book had taught her to watch for in the spring and autumn tick fever seasons. By the end of the first calendar year, she had recorded 0 tick counts above the threshold of 3 adult ticks per heifer head, 0 clinical symptom entries of any kind, and an average annual weight gain on the yearlings that was 11% above the Newton County commercial-Hereford average reported in the November 1973 Texas A&M Beef Cattle Extension Bulletin. The second year, 1974, was quieter still. The breeding flock of the 200 Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl had hatched and raised 140 new keats across the spring and summer in the small mobile wooden roost house at the back of the pasture, and by August, the working flock had reached 320 birds. The tick counts on the lead heifers had fallen to a year-round average of less than 1 adult tick per heifer head, and the spring biting fly count at the morning milking shed had fallen to a level that Verna's mother-in-law, Adelaide Boudreaux, who had visited in late June from her own small homestead near Mamou, had pronounced in the soft Acadian-French of her own girlhood equal to the cleanest pastures of the Atchafalaya Basin in the year of her own first cattle in 1928. Across the section road, the Tatum Cattle Company conventional Hereford operation continued its quarterly insecticide dip cycle and its monthly organophosphate impregnated cattle fly ear tag replacement protocol. And Cyrus Tatum continued to stand at the cross-fence corner of the section road in his sweat-stained tanned Stetson straw rancher's hat, and to shake his head slowly at the small spotted birds chattering across Verna Boudreaux's pasture. And Loretta Tatum continued to laugh in the small Burkeville feed and seed store on State Highway 87, and to clap her powdered hand over her painted coral pink mouth in mock pity whenever Verna Boudreaux walked in for her weekly scratch grain and crushed oyster shell needs. The mockery Eulalie Boudreaux had told the 6-year-old Verna in the summer of 1948 was the second part of the long Acadian-French inheritance of the Boudreaux family women, and the small spotted birds and the broad red cattle and the long quiet Cajun-French patience were the first part, and the third part, Eulalie had said, was the work of waiting for the spring and the autumn of the year, when the small spotted birds and the broad red cattle would do the explaining for themselves. The third year, 1975, brought the first quiet ripple of the long warning that the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service would later trace in the formal April 1978 Regional Outbreak Bulletin, back to the Newton-Jasper-Sabine-Orange County border region of deep East Texas. 3 calves on a small commercial Hereford operation 11 miles north of Burkeville on the Jasper County side of the line went down in late April 1975 with the pale-eyed wasting and the red water and the slow weakness that the local Jasper County veterinarian Dr. Carl Henson identified by morning blood smear under his small parish clinic microscope as a moderate clinical case of Anaplasma marginale, of the type that the Southern American commercial cattle industry had been managing through the standard organophosphate dip protocol since the early 1960s. The 3 calves were treated, 2 recovered, 1 died, and the small commercial Hereford operation 11 miles north of Burkeville absorbed the $700 loss and increased the frequency of its quarterly dip cycle to a 6-week dip cycle and went on with the year. The Jasper County Cattlemen's Association noted the case in its May newsletter as an early-season anaplasmosis case of the type to be expected after a moderately warm and moderately wet winter, and the Newton County Cattlemen's Association noted nothing at all. Across the section road from Verna Boudreaux's pasture, the Tatum Cattle Company conventional Hereford operation reported no clinical cases through the spring and summer of 1975, and Cyrus Tatum continued to shake his head slowly at the small spotted birds chattering across Verna Boudreaux's pasture, and Loretta Tatum continued to laugh in the small Burkeville feed and seed store. The 4th year, 1976, brought the second ripple. By the end of the spring tick season in late June 1976, the Texas Animal Health Commission had recorded 27 clinical anaplasmosis cases across the Newton-Jasper-Sabine-Orange County border region, up from the 3 cases of the previous spring, and the regional commercial cattle veterinarians in Beaumont and Lufkin and Nacogdoches were beginning, in their quiet professional conversations at the monthly Texas Veterinary Medical Association district meetings, to raise the careful technical question of whether the Lone Star ticks and the Gulf Coast ticks of the deep East Texas piney woods might be developing a resistance to the standard commercial organophosphate dip compounds that the regional agricultural chemical supply cooperatives had been selling continuously into the region since 1973. The careful technical question was raised in the August 1976 issue of the Southern Beef Cattle Production Journal by a young Texas A&M Extension veterinarian named Dr. Margaret Holloway, who held a doctorate in veterinary parasitology from Cornell University and who had been assigned to the Deep East Texas Regional District in 1975. And the careful technical question was answered in the December 1976 issue of the same journal by the regional sales and research representatives of the three principal commercial organophosphate dip manufacturers, who concluded, on the basis of the controlled laboratory dip trial results from the company-operated test pens in Houston and Beaumont, that no statistically significant resistance had developed in the deep East Texas tick populations, and that the standard commercial dip cycle protocol remained fully effective. The careful technical question was not raised again in the regional commercial cattle press for the next 16 months. The fifth year, 1977, brought the third and quietest ripple. Verna Boudreaux's working flock of 320 Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl, now 5 years into the slow, methodical pasture and cattleback foraging pattern that her grandmother Eulalie had described in the long, quiet evenings of 1948, was producing tick counts of less than 1/2 adult tick per heifer head across the spring and summer tick season, and the morning biting fly count at the milking shed had fallen to a level that the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of Eulalie Boudreaux's 19th-century bayou-country husbandry described in the soft, cursive Acadian-French of an 1892 parish-veterinarian's handwriting as the desired condition of a properly worked Cajun-French pasture. The 35 red-bodied, white-faced Hereford cattle were in the best body condition score of the 5-year tally book. The spring calf crop had weaned at an average weight that was 14% above the Newton County commercial. Hereford average reported in the August 1977 Texas A&M Beef Cattle Extension Bulletin, and the small Cajun-French parish veterinarian Dr. Theodore Landry of Burkeville, who had been making the annual May herd health visit to the Boudreaux operation since the August 1971 settling of the Beauregard Boudreaux estate, had recorded in his small-bound clinical notebook the formal entry: 0 clinical symptoms across the herd, 0 anaplasmosis blood smear positives, 0 tick fever titer positives, body condition uniformly excellent. Across the section road, the Tatum Cattle Company conventional Hereford operation reported its first 3 clinical anaplasmosis cases of the decade in late June 1977, and Cyrus Tatum tripled the frequency of his quarterly dip cycle to a 3-week dip cycle and absorbed the cost of the additional organophosphate dip solution and went on with the year. And Loretta Tatum continued to laugh in the small Burkeville feed and seed store on State Highway 87, though the laugh was beginning, by the end of the autumn of 1977, to carry a faint edge that had not been there before. The winter of 1977 and 1978 came in warm and wet across the deep East Texas piney woods. The November and December 1977 rainfall totals for the Newton-Jasper-Sabine-Orange County border region were 148% of the 30-year regional average reported by the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and the average minimum daily temperatures for the month of January 1978 were 11 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the 30-year regional average. The warm, wet winter doctor, Margaret Holloway of the Texas A&M Extension Service, would later write in the formal April 1978 Regional Outbreak Bulletin, produced what the Deep South parasitology literature had been warning regional commercial cattle producers about since the late 1960s. A massive overwintering survival of adult and nymphal Lone Star ticks, Gulf Coast ticks, and Amblyomma maculatum nymph populations across the affected county region, combined with an unusually early spring eruption of the seasonal biting fly populations that serve as the secondary mechanical vector for Anaplasma marginale transmission in Southern American commercial cattle herds. The spring eruption began on the 4 counties' worth of conventional commercial Hereford operations across the Newton-Jasper-Sabine-Orange County border region in the second week of April 1978, and within 6 weeks, the regional commercial cattle veterinarians of Beaumont and Lufkin and Nacogdoches were filing emergency clinical case reports to the Texas Animal Health Commission at a rate that had not been seen in deep East Texas since the documented major regional outbreak of 1947. The Texas Animal Health Commission and the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service issued the formal April 13, 1978 Regional Outbreak, 1978 Regional Outbreak Bulletin to all licensed commercial cattle veterinarians in the affected county region, the formal May 9, 1978 follow-up bulletin to all licensed commercial cattle producers in the affected county region, and the formal June 15, 1978 Comprehensive Impact Assessment Bulletin to the regional commercial cattle press, the regional commercial cattle insurance carriers, and the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. The April 13 bulletin documented, on the basis of the regional commercial cattle veterinarian emergency clinical case reports of the first 3 weeks of the outbreak, that the carrier tick populations of the affected county region had developed a documented and statistically significant level of resistance to the 3 principal commercial organophosphate dip compounds in regional use since 1973, that the controlled laboratory dip trial results from the company-operated test pens in Houston and Beaumont had been derived from non-resistant founder tick populations that did not represent the field-resistant tick populations of the deep East Texas piney woods, and that the standard commercial dip cycle protocol was no longer providing the historical level of carrier tick control in the affected county region. The May 9th follow-up bulletin documented calf mortality rates of 14 to 22% across the affected herds and adult mortality rates of 9 to 15%. The June 15th Comprehensive Impact Assessment Bulletin documented total regional commercial cattle losses across the 4-county region of more than $420,000 in the first 10 weeks of the outbreak. The loss of 9 of the 22 largest commercial Hereford operations in the region to bankruptcy or to mortgage sale, and the total functional collapse of the regional organophosphate dip-vat infrastructure as the affected commercial cattle producers turned to emergency hand application of doxycycline injection and supportive tetracycline-based blood transfusion therapy at the regional commercial cattle veterinary clinics. Dr. Margaret Holloway of the Texas A&M Extension Service drove the 174 miles from her small district office in Nacogdoches to the Boudreaux Gate at the section road of the 80-acre Newton County Hereford pasture on the warm, bright Tuesday morning of May 23, 1978, in her dark green 1975 Ford station wagon with the small Texas A&M maroon and white shield on the driver's side door. And she stepped out of the station wagon in her starched white knee-length veterinary lab coat over her forest green button-down shirt and her dark gray wool slacks and her polished low brown leather Oxford shoes, and she carried her small clipboard of field bulletin pages in her left hand and her stethoscope draped around her neck and her small leather field veterinary case in her right hand, and she walked through the open gate at the section road toward the live oak tree at the back of the pasture and the small mobile wooden roost house and the small spotted blue and red-headed pearl gray and lavender guinea fowl, chattering in tight, small flocks across the open Bermuda grass pasture middles and perched on the broad red and white backs of the patient Hereford cattle. Verna Boudreaux met her at the live oak tree in her faded indigo blue long-sleeve cotton chambray workshirt and her brown leather belt and her faded brown duck canvas brush pants and her knee-high tan leather lace-up cowman boots and her long, heavy, waxed canvas brown stockman's apron, and she lifted the brim of her wide-brimmed tan straw cattlewoman's hat in a quiet, courteous greeting, and she offered Dr. Holloway a cup of warm chicory coffee from the small enameled coffee pot she had carried out to the live oak tree in a small wicker basket. Dr. Holloway accepted the chicory coffee with quiet thanks, and the two women stood together at the base of the live oak tree for several minutes without speaking and watched the small spotted birds work the broad red backs of the patient cattle. And then Dr. Holloway opened her small leather field veterinary case, and she set the wooden squeeze-chute notebook on the wagon wheel platform, and she said, in her composed, quiet, professional voice, that the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service had received reports from the regional commercial cattle press that the Boudreaux operation on the section road north of Burkeville had reported 0 clinical anaplasmosis cases through the worst regional outbreak in deep East Texas since 1947, and that she had come, with the permission of the operator, to collect a full set of morning and afternoon blood smear samples on the lead heifers and a full set of tick density by square foot pasture survey samples across the 80 acres to confirm or to disconfirm the report. Verna Boudreaux set her own enameled tin cup of chicory coffee on the wagon wheel platform, and she nodded once, slowly, and she said, in her quiet, level voice, that the doctor was welcome, and that the small spotted birds had been waiting for her for 5.5 years. They worked together through the long, bright Tuesday morning and into the warm, bright Tuesday afternoon, and Dr. Holloway pulled 24 morning and afternoon blood smear samples from the lead heifers at the wooden squeeze-chute by the live oak tree, and she walked the full 80 acres with her small wooden tick density survey frame, and she recorded 120 tick density by square foot pasture survey samples in her small-bound clinical notebook, and she pulled the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of Eulalie Boudreaux's 19th century bayou-country husbandry onto the wagon wheel platform, and she read it in slow, careful silence for the better part of an hour, while Verna Boudreaux sat quietly beside her and watched the small spotted birds chatter across the pasture and perch on the broad red backs of the patient cattle. The formal Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service field visit on the warm, bright Tuesday morning of May 23, 1978, was followed in the long, quiet weeks that followed Dr. Margaret Holloway's filing of the formal commendation report by a steady arrival of regional and then national agricultural press correspondents at the open gate at the section road of the 80-acre Newton County Hereford pasture. The Southern Beef Cattle Production Journal correspondent arrived on the morning of June 7, 1978, in a faded brown 1973 Plymouth Fury sedan, and photographed the small spotted birds chattering across the pasture and perched on the broad red backs of the patient cattle from a careful, respectful distance with a Pentax K1035mm camera on a wooden tripod. And the Progressive Farmer correspondent arrived on the morning of June 14, 1978, in a faded blue 1975 Chevrolet Impala sedan, and recorded a 2-hour interview with Verna Boudreaux at the wagon wheel platform at the base of the live oak tree on a small portable Sony cassette recorder. And the country gentleman correspondent arrived on the morning of June 21, 1978, in a faded green 1976 Ford Pinto wagon, and stayed 2.5 days at the small clapboard farmhouse on the south side of the pasture, and produced the feature-length 7-page photo essay that ran in the August 1978 issue under the title The Cajun Widow and the 200 Birds, How the Long Acadian-French Inheritance Saved an 80-acre East Texas Hereford operation from the worst tick fever outbreak in a generation. The August 1978 Country Gentleman photo essay was reprinted in the September 1978 Reader's Digest Condensed Features section and was excerpted in the October 1978 Mother Earth News Heritage Husbandry feature column, and was referenced in the December 1978 Smithsonian Magazine Year-End Agricultural Heritage Retrospective by the Senior Smithsonian Institution Agricultural History Curator Dr. Helena Brockman as the documented mid-century resurrection of a pre-industrial bayou-country husbandry tradition that had been quietly preserved across 140 years, of Cajun-French parish women's oral and written transmission from the 1830s to the late 1970s. The 4 older Cajun-French parish women of Burkeville, who had pressed the leather-bound family receipt book of her grandmother Eulalie into Verna Boudreaux's hands at the St. Joseph funeral reception in May 1971, came to the small clapboard farmhouse on the warm, bright Saturday afternoon of July 8, 1978, in a single faded white 1968 Buick LeSabre sedan, driven by the eldest of the 4 parish women, the 84-year-old Madame Cécile Arsenault of the small Cajun-French settlement at Bonvier. And they sat on the front porch of the small clapboard farmhouse in the 4 hand-built rocking chairs that Beauregard Boudreaux had built for the porch in the summer of 1964. And they drank warm chicory coffee from the small enameled coffee pot, and they spoke in the soft Acadian-French of the long, quiet bayou-country parish evenings, and they told Verna Boudreaux that the long Cajun-French inheritance of the bayou-country grandmothers had passed on the warm, bright Saturday afternoon of July 8, 1978, into her keeping for the next generation of the Boudreaux family women, and that the receipt book of her grandmother Eulalie and the small spotted birds and the broad red backs of the patient cattle were now, formally, hers to carry forward into the long, quiet decades of the late 20th century and the early 21st century of the deep East Texas piney woods. The Texas Department of Agriculture Commissioner Reagan Fifby Brown drove the 241 miles from his small Austin office at the state capitol building to the open gate at the section road of the 80-acre Newton County Hereford pasture on the warm, bright Wednesday morning of August 2nd, 1978, in a black 1978 Lincoln Continental sedan, with the small Texas Department of Agriculture seal on the driver's side door. And he stood at the open gate at the section road with his hat held respectfully against his chest, and he presented Verna Boudreaux with the formal Texas Department of Agriculture Heritage Husbandry Commendation Medal, a small bronze medallion the size of a silver dollar, cast with the small spotted figure of a pearl gray guinea hen, perched on the broad shoulder of a patient Hereford cow. And he made the brief formal speech that the small handful of regional commercial cattle correspondents who had driven out from Beaumont and Lufkin and Nacogdoches with their wooden tripod Pentax cameras recorded for the front page of the August 4th, 1978 Regional Commercial Cattle Press, that the Boudreaux operation of Newton County had, by the quiet, patient 5.5-year work of one Cajun-French widow and 200 small spotted birds and 35 patient Hereford cattle and the long Acadian-French inheritance of the bayou-country grandmothers, accomplished what the regional agricultural chemical supply cooperatives and the commercial organophosphate dip manufacturers and the Texas Commercial Cattle Veterinary Establishment had failed to accomplish across the long, warm, wet winter of 1977 and the long, terrible spring outbreak of 1978, and that the state of Texas was, on this warm, bright Wednesday morning of August 2nd, 1978, formally and publicly grateful. When the warm, bright Tuesday afternoon sun had crossed the western section road and the small mobile wooden roost house at the back of the pasture was beginning to take the long late afternoon shadow of the live oak tree doctor, Margaret Holloway closed her small leather field veterinary case, and she packed her small wooden tick density survey frame back into the rear of the dark green 1975 Ford station wagon, and she walked back to the wagon wheel platform at the base of the live oak tree where Verna Boudreaux was waiting with the small enameled coffee pot. And she said, in her composed, quiet, professional voice, that the morning and afternoon blood smear samples from the 24 lead heifers were 100% negative for Anaplasma marginale, that the tick density by square foot pasture survey samples across the full 80 acres had averaged 0.03 adult ticks per square foot against the regional outbreak week average of 3.8 adult ticks per square foot, that the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of Eulalie Boudreaux's 19th century bayou-country husbandry was a document of regional veterinary historical importance that she would like, with the operator's permission, to make a careful longhand copy for the permanent regional archive of the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Library at College Station, and that she would be filing on the basis of the Tuesday afternoon field results a formal commendation report to the Texas Animal Health Commission, citing the Boudreaux operation as the regional reference site for the documented successful integrated poultry pest management protocol of the deep East Texas piney woods. Verna Boudreaux set her hand on the rough bark of the live oak tree, and she nodded once, slowly, and she did not smile, but the set of her quiet, stubborn mouth eased, and she said, in the soft Acadian-French her grandmother Eulalie had taught her in the long, quiet evenings of 1948, that the small spotted birds had been waiting for the doctor, and that the doctor was welcome to copy the great-grandmother's receipt book and to send a copy of the longhand transcription back to the small Cajun-French parish archive at St. Joseph in Burkeville, where her grandmother Eulalie was buried under a small white limestone cross beside Beauregard Boudreaux. Dr. Holloway, who had been raised in the small Cajun-French parish of St. Martinville, Louisiana, and who had not heard the soft Acadian-French of the bayou-country in 17 years, lifted her own hand to her chest in a small involuntary Cajun-French gesture of recognition, and she answered Verna Boudreaux in the soft Acadian-French of her own girlhood that the small spotted birds had been waiting for many of them, and that the work of the long, quiet Cajun-French patients was the long inheritance of all of the bayou-country grandmothers, and that the receipt book would be transcribed with the same care and the same respect that her own grandmother had given to the small spotted feather, pressed into the palm of a 6-year-old child in the summer of 1948. The formal Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service commendation report on the Boudreaux operation was filed to the Texas Animal Health Commission on the morning of June 2, 1978, and the formal Texas Animal Health Commission citation of the Boudreaux operation as the regional reference site for the documented successful integrated poultry pest management protocol of the deep East Texas piney woods was published in the Regional Commercial Cattle Press in the third week of June 1978. And on the warm, bright Wednesday morning of June 28, 1978, a small green 1977 Lincoln Continental sedan with a Harris County license plate rolled slowly to a stop at the gate at the section road of the 80-acre Newton County Hereford pasture, and Étienne Doucet, the 56-year-old Cajun-French Acadian-American Houston wholesale specialty meats broker, stepped out of the sedan in his charcoal gray wool sport jacket and his cream dress shirt and his deep red wool tie and his dark gray wool slacks and his polished brown leather Oxford shoes, and he carried his small brown leather portfolio in his left hand, and he walked through the open gate at the section road toward the live oak tree at the back of the pasture. Verna Boudreaux met him at the live oak tree in her faded indigo blue long-sleeve cotton chambray work shirt and her brown leather belt and her faded brown duck canvas brush pants and her knee-high tanned leather lace-up cowman boots and her long, heavy waxed canvas brown stockman's apron, and she offered him a cup of warm chicory coffee from the small enameled coffee pot she had carried out to the live oak tree in the small wicker basket. Étienne Doucet, who had been raised in the small Cajun-French parish of Mamou, Louisiana, in the same parish of Evangeline Parish that had been the long ancestral parish of the Boudreaux family women, accepted the chicory coffee with quiet thanks, and he spoke to Verna Boudreaux in the soft Acadian-French of his own girlhood village, and he said that he had read the formal Texas Animal Health Commission citation of the Boudreaux operation in the Regional Commercial Cattle Press, and that he had driven the 124 miles north from his small wholesale specialty meats office on the third floor of the brick warehouse building at the corner of Travis Street and Prairie Avenue in downtown Houston to make her an offer. The offer, he said, was a 5-year exclusive supply contract for the entire annual production of the Boudreaux operation at a wholesale live weight price of $1.85 per pound, paid in full on the morning of pickup at the Boudreaux squeeze-chute by the live oak tree, with the freight and the slaughter and the cut and wrap and the cold chain transport handled by Doucet Specialty Meats of Houston for delivery to the 23 high-end restaurant accounts of the Houston and Galveston downtown culinary district that he had been supplying with verified, clean, tick fever-free heritage breed Hereford beef since the founding of the firm in 1961. The wholesale live weight price of $1.85 per pound, he added, was 3 times the late June 1978 commercial commodity live weight Hereford rate that the regional commercial cattle press had reported the previous Friday at the Beaumont auction barn, and the 5-year exclusive supply contract carried a single-page handwritten addendum which he had drafted on the brown leather portfolio in the front seat of the green 1977 Lincoln Continental sedan on the long drive north from Houston, and the addendum read, in the soft, formal Acadian-French of his own girlhood parish, that the contract was tendered as the formal commercial recognition of the long Cajun-French inheritance of the bayou-country grandmothers, and the small spotted birds, and the broad red backs of the patient cattle. Verna Boudreaux read the single-page handwritten addendum slowly, twice, at the wagon wheel platform at the base of the live oak tree, and she set her own enameled tin cup of chicory coffee on the wagon wheel platform, and she lifted her amber-brown eyes to the small spotted birds chattering across her pasture and perched on the broad red backs of her patient Hereford cattle, and she set her hand on the rough bark of the live oak tree, and she nodded once, slowly, and she signed the contract with the small brass-handled fountain pen Étienne Doucet had offered her from the breast pocket of his charcoal gray wool sport jacket. The first pickup was scheduled for the morning of August 15th, 1978. The November 1978 Regional Commercial Cattle Press reported that the Boudreaux operation had grossed, on the August and September and October pickups of the first contract season alone, more than $38,000 in delivered wholesale live weight cattle revenue against an estimated commodity equivalent of less than $12,400 at the Beaumont auction barn, and that the Tatum Cattle Company conventional Hereford operation across the section road had reported in the same November 1978 Regional Commercial Cattle Press a calendar year operating loss of more than $87,000 from a combined herd mortality and emergency veterinary treatment burden of more than 220 animals. The foreclosure listing of the 840-acre Tatum operation on the Newton County Tax Assessor's quarterly auction notice for the first time in 3 generations, and the public withdrawal of Cyrus Tatum from his 3rd term as president of the Newton County Cattlemen's Association. On the cool, dry Wednesday morning of November 29, 1978, 6 weeks after the public withdrawal and 4 weeks after the foreclosure listing, Cyrus Tatum walked the 1,100 yards from the front porch of his small clapboard farmhouse across the section road to the open gate at the Boudreaux pasture, and he carried his sweat-stained tan Stetson straw rancher's hat against his chest in both hands, and he stopped at the open gate at the section road, and he waited. Verna Boudreaux saw him from the wagon wheel platform at the base of the live oak tree, and she set down her morning enameled tin cup of chicory coffee, and she walked the long, slow walk across the 80-acre Bermuda grass pasture toward the open gate at the section road, with the small spotted Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl chattering at her boot heels, and the patient Hereford cattle lifting their broad red and white heads to watch her go. And she met Cyrus Tatum at the open gate at the section road in the cool, dry, late November morning light. Cyrus Tatum did not lift his eyes to hers. He held his sweat-stained tan Stetson straw rancher's hat against his chest in both hands, and he said, in a voice that the wide brim of his hat could not muffle, that he had come to ask the small Cajun-French Boudreaux widow for the loan of the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book of Eulalie Boudreaux's 19th-century bayou-country husbandry, and for the loan of 50 Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl breeding pairs, and for the loan of the small Cajun-French parish-veterinarian Dr. Theodore Landry of Burkeville's quiet professional time, and that he would pay her on whatever schedule and at whatever interest rate she set, for as long as it took to set his foreclosed 840-acre operation back onto the working basis of the small spotted birds and the broad red backs of the patient cattle and the long Cajun-French inheritance of the bayou-country grandmothers. Verna Boudreaux did not answer him for a long moment. She set her hand on the top board of the open gate at the section road, and she lifted her amber-brown eyes to the cool, dry, late November sky above the deep East Texas piney woods, and she did not smile. But the set of her quiet, stubborn mouth eased for the second time since the May night the East Texas Highway Patrol had come to her door with their hats against their chests in May 1971. And then she nodded once, slowly, and she opened the gate, and she said, in the soft Acadian-French her grandmother Eulalie had taught her in the long, quiet evenings of 1948, that the small spotted birds had been waiting for him, too, and that he was welcome to come into the pasture. The Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine Extension Service issued in March 1979 the formal Regional Integrated Poultry-Pest-Management Bulletin titled The Boudreaux Protocol for Cajun-French Heritage Guinea Fowl Tick and Fly Control in deep East Texas commercial-Hereford operations, and the formal bulletin became, over the long, quiet decades that followed, the foundation reference document of the documented American integrated poultry pest management movement in southern cattle country. Verna Boudreaux, who lived to the age of 91 and who died in her sleep on the warm, bright Tuesday morning of August 13th, 2033, under the spreading branches of the same live oak tree at the back of the same 80-acre Newton County Hereford pasture, with the small spotted Pearl Gray and Lavender Guinea Fowl of the 7th generation of the Boudreaux Foundation flock chattering quietly across the open Bermuda grass pasture middles, and perched on the broad red and white backs of the patient Hereford cattle of the 9th generation of the Boudreaux Foundation herd, was buried under a small white limestone cross in the St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery at the edge of Burkeville, between Beauregard Boudreaux and her grandmother Eulalie Boudreaux, and the inscription on her small white limestone cross was carved in the soft, formal Acadian-French of the Bayou Country Parish archives, with the single line that the small Cajun-French parish priest had read aloud from the leather-bound great-grandmother's receipt book at the warm, bright Tuesday afternoon funeral mass. The small spotted birds have been waiting,